Massive thank you as always to our top tier patron, Sarah Turner. It's Not Just In Your Head is hosted by psychotherapist Dr. Harriet Frudd, substance use disorder counsellor Ikoi Hiro, and myself, the editor and producer Liam Tate. This podcast is entirely funded by listeners, and as the famous meme states, we are critiquing capitalism because we are forced to participate in it in order to survive. So, if you can afford to give, then your contribution will ensure that we can keep making the show. However, if you can't, then please just leave a review on your podcast platform of choice, tell your friends about us, and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, or YouTube.
In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
If you're comfortable doing like a little intro about you, both yourselves, then we can jump into the questions.
Okay. I'm Shani Orgad. I'm a professor of media and communications at the London School of Economics and Political Science. I am a sociologist by training. I'm also a cultural analyst. And both my teaching and my research focus on gender, feminism, and the media, particularly in the context of inequality in contemporary culture. I also teach about the ways in which contemporary media representations shape our imagination and our understanding of migration. And my work really runs across a range of spheres and contexts, but it's unified by a question that really concerns me, which is how cultural and media narratives really shape public imaginations and crucially shape lived experiences and practices in the context of deepening inequalities, in the context of the cementing of neoliberal rationality and the intensifying kind of ubiquity and centrality of media and communication technologies in our lives today. And that's something that's really animated my work, particularly in relation to the ways in which neoliberal ideas of individualism, of choice, of self-responsibility, and dispositions of positivity and cheerfulness and triumphalism, and more recently in the work with Rosalind, confidence, how they circulate in contemporary narratives, but also very much how individuals and women in particular take up these narratives, negotiate them, occasionally resist them, and how they attach to the subject positions that are constructed by public discourses across different media.
That's great.
Wow. Great introduction. So how do I follow that? I'm Rosalind Gill. I'm Professor of Social and Cultural Analysis at City, University of London. And I trained in psychology and sociology. And really over the last sort of 3.5 decades, I've been working at the intersection of psychosocial studies, media and cultural studies, and a whole range of other kind of critical labors, and teaching and writing in those areas. And like Shani, one of the things that really interests me is really this kind of relationship between culture and subjectivity, and how it is that, you know, things that are circulating, discourses and ideas that are circulating somehow shape us and get inside and become what we experience as part of our deepest feelings. So we are colleagues and we are friends, and we're also neighbors. And so we've been working across different fields, and we've been working around work and parenting, about intimate relationships and the body, about global development. And each of us in our different work began to notice the rise of imperatives to confidence and to these related dispositions like resilience and positive thinking. And we were interested in how they were particularly directed towards women, and they were taking on a new cultural prominence across apparently completely unrelated spheres. So you could see it in the welfare system, you could see it in consumer culture, you could see it in workplace confidence initiatives, you could see it in self-help, in relationship advice, and even in international development initiatives. And it was one of those things where once you notice it, you start seeing it everywhere. And obviously we had to build in some safeguards around confirmation bias. But yeah, we started seeing it everywhere. And as we walked around our neighborhood, particularly during the pandemic, we talked and talked. And that's really how the book evolved.
Yeah, it's a really, really fascinating read. And obviously, like I said, the Psych articles where I first came across it with the slightly spicy title, The Cult of Being Confident and Why It Doesn't Help Women. I'm wondering how people responded to it, just the article as well as the book.
Yeah, it's interesting. What really struck us is how so many people who wrote to us or interviewed us said the very same, almost the same thing. And they said that how it resonated and how it offered them almost a vocabulary to articulate something that they felt, but they couldn't quite put a finger on and to name it. And that was very, in many ways reassuring. I suppose every researcher wants this to happen, but in many other ways, we would have wished to live in a world where it didn't resonate and it didn't ring true. And in particular, I think one of the things that was very much evident in people's responses and is how they said it when they read the book or when they read articles or interviews, they realized how angry they were, which is perhaps not directly, but indirectly part of what we were hoping to achieve. Angry about the ways in which the confidence culture constantly and continuously directs both the problem and solution into the self and puts the onus particularly on women, because we argue that confidence culture is gendered in profound ways, puts the onus on the individual to somehow overcome a supposed deficit or a supposed crisis of confidence, often called confidence gap, rather than direct, as it were, turn the telescope outwards, and rather than think about the structures that create this supposed lack of confidence in the first place, and particularly the ways in which workplaces or messaging around the body or messaging and ideologies of parenting and motherhood or around sex and intimate relationships, all these kind of domains, as well as within international development, these are the domains we look at, how all these really constantly and continuously focus attention on what's supposedly needs to be fixed within and in women rather than what needs to be fixed in our world. And yeah, that's the responses we received. I think, to be honest, also, we try to make it very clear in the book, but nevertheless, sometimes it's perhaps misinterpreted or misunderstood, or not, although not a lot. And we want to emphasize this also here, is that our critique and our criticism is not directed at women as individuals. If anything, that's precisely the problem we want to highlight. So sometimes women would tell us when we did lots of workshops or talks, and they would say, but I actually just watched Amy Cuddy on the TED Talk and just practiced those power poses and they helped me, or I just downloaded this app with all these affirmations. And our criticism is not of individuals. In fact, as we very much highlight, we are ourselves very much implicated in this culture. We're not somehow outside it or above it. So we're very ambivalent about the confidence culture because we are ourselves not inured in any ways to the really affective force of the confidence culture. Our criticism and critique is really directed at the ways in which it has become a culture and indeed a cult, something that is not questioned, an article of faith that is taken for granted as a good, as a common good, rather than of individuals who are either taking up these discourses and these practices and these techniques in an attempt to really survive, let alone thrive in neoliberalism.
The article even mentions how much like therapy speak has invaded corporate speak in a lot of ways. And confidence is one of those things that's constantly broached in therapy and treatment spaces. So much of what most people understand as confidence is like affect and emotion. A lot of times when I'm sitting in group and I'm talking to people and what is confidence, right? They talk about positive feelings. It is a performance. It is an affect. It is a feeling, when ultimately confidence is basically the sense that a person has that they have the ability to adjust to challenges. And one of the things about a lot of workplace and social spaces in our current society is not one that creates like a cooperative environment in any way.
Right. Yeah, adjust to challenges by yourself.
And again, that's one of the major issues of how confidence is parsed out in society and how people often feel like it's something that they can never have, right?
I think you put it so succinctly there, really powerfully, about the way that therapy speak has been invaded by corporate speak, or it's appropriated it. And yeah, I think that's exactly what we were aiming to capture in the book, and to really just question the idea that this is something that people have to work on their own, in front of the mirror with their gratitude diaries and their little post-it notes on the mirror telling them to believe in themselves, instead of actually changing the system that erodes their self-belief in the first place.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because one of the huge aspects of like marketing is basically when you put something out as a desirable thing, right? Whether it's confidence or beauty or money or whatever, the value of that in our society is that it has to be rare. They can't be like common. And ultimately, whenever I see this kind of confident positioning, et cetera, that is in society and how it's used in marketing, right? Again, like it is absolutely not done as an attainable thing. And that's ultimately what drives people into these confidence, quote unquote, gaps. And it's also one of those things where there are huge like class and social factors. I remember there was this client that kind of mentioned off to the side because he always slumped down, looked down. And I was talking about his body language with him. And he was just like, oh, yeah, when I was younger, it was one of those things where I used to have really good posture. I used to look at people straight in the eye. And I kept getting this feedback of you shouldn't have this confident body language for the lack of vocabulary and education that you have.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I would just add that while confidence, I would agree with you, is cast and constructed as a rare commodity, as it were, it's cast in this way in profoundly gendered ways, as well as, you say, raced and classed ways. One of the things we noted as we were amassing, we came to have what we call the confidence basket. We literally had a physical basket where we were just tear things from magazines and collect over the years a lot of examples, as well as a digital basket. And one of the things that struck us and became very clear, the more examples and the more sites we were examining, is how this idea that you should attain this unattainable thing called confidence is addressed very differently to men and women. That while there are incitements to men to feel more confident, for instance, say in dating websites or in advertising campaign for Viagra or so on, there were fundamental differences. And one of the crucial differences was that for men, the work of becoming confident is often framed as a concerted effort that has an end. And it's also more about being confident in a particular skill or a particular situation, whereas for women is very much presented as an ongoing psychological self-improvement project and a bottomless pit. Yeah, it's 24/7 ongoing kind of work in progress. And you can never become fully confident. And even if you are, you need to be on the alert because you might run out of confidence. One of the examples, and we share it in the book, was that as part of the research, we did lots of quizzes. There are many quizzes online that you can measure your confidence levels. And we took the quiz that is part of Kane Shipman's, it's a New York Times bestseller as well, The Confidence Code. And they have a website where you can quiz yourself to measure your confidence levels. And unsurprisingly, we both scored very high. We were very much aware of the different privilege, the class, education, and the kind of capital we possessed that allowed us to score high. But even when we scored high, we then got this notification or this warning not to rest on our laurels. And it said something along the lines of, you may have scored high in confidence, but make sure that you maintain that. And you might feel confident now, but in other situations, you might need further training and so on. And that's very different. We didn't find this when it was addressed to men. So I think it's really important also that kind of the differences are highlighted, because it is a gendered technology of self, as well as very much a classed one and a racialized technology of self.
One of the things that was interesting in reading the book was this coming across the sort of vulnerability thing as well. And that does this actually counteract our examination around the confidence thing? I've called it performative vulnerability, but I can't remember quite the terms you use. But I wondered if you wanted to talk about that side of stuff.
Yeah, Ros, do you want me to take it, or do you want...
Yeah, I think so, especially because of your even more recent work. Yes.
Okay. Yeah, so thank you. What happened is when we started, as I said before, collecting our confidence materials and putting them in our basket, we started noticing proliferation of incitements towards embracing vulnerability, or what you really nicely called, Liam, performative vulnerability, especially in the context of the difficult events of 2020, the kind of both COVID as well as the kind of resurgence of anti-racist movements. And it seemed at first to both of us as a kind of a reverse move. We thought, wait a minute, our thesis is being challenged here. And perhaps the person or / brand that's perhaps most recognized for championing and popularizing this idea is Brené Brown, which we also call the kind of vulnerability guru, with her both highly popular TED Talk and her Netflix program, The Call to Courage, and where she calls on employees to bring their whole self and be, quote, courageously vulnerable at work. But it's also been manifest in many other anti-perfection, as it were, trends, and the kind of imperative to be vulnerable and to share your pain on different platforms. Most recently, and we note it in the book, and I'm developing it into further work now, on LinkedIn, which is a very surprising platform to see people sharing their vulnerability. But back to your question, Liam, I think while we ourselves thought at first that seems to be going against, and in some ways it does, going against confidence culture, we did find that ultimately, rather than contradictory, this new normative ideal of vulnerability seems to actually be deeply implicated and in confidence culture and bolstered. And that's in several ways, because first of all, the call to embrace vulnerability, for instance, in the workplace, pretty much exclusively what it does, it furthers the imperative to look inward again and to work on the self. There's rarely, or we found very little, parallel call to think about vulnerability as a structural issue, or the solutions to vulnerability as ones that are rooted in relying on others. There's little talk about developing and investing in community. And crucially, there's also limited, if any, discussion of the structural sources of vulnerability. So again, vulnerability is cast as something that is innate, is somehow a personal psychological problem that can be overcome in individualized ways. There's very little connection between issues like poverty, like ill health, racism, sexism, to vulnerability. And also one of the other things we noted time and again in discussions of vulnerability is how it seems to be allowed and even celebrated so long as it's located safely in the past. So this is manifest, for instance, in lots of celebrities' confessions about, and particularly female celebrities' confessions about their imposter syndrome. Yeah. So they often confess about this as a vulnerability, but they do it when, if you wish, when they're on the other side, when they've overcome their insecurities. And so what we argue in the book is that in this way, being vulnerable becomes actually yet another site of privilege, because only very particular people can afford to be and seem vulnerable. And in fact, there was lots of backlash and people paid quite high price for being vulnerable, for instance, on online platform, when this was then being identified by their employers, for instance. And again, I think the last really important thing to say here is very much like confidence culture. The commandment to harness vulnerability is also profoundly gendered. So there have been lots of male business leaders like David Solomon, CEO and chairman of Goldman Sachs, or Tim Cook from Apple. they were very vocal in calling workers to foreground their pain and vulnerability, but it's women who seem to be the kind of enthusiastic recipients of this. And so if you look at culture and media, it's most often, for instance, women who confess about imposter syndrome and so on. Perhaps this is changing now in interesting ways with the debate on mental health, at least in the UK. But still, there's a gendered element to who expresses vulnerability. And from, what I've looked recently at LinkedIn, I can tell you that it's almost exclusively women who, for instance, post their images crying on LinkedIn. You'd still find very little images of men sharing vulnerabilities in this way.
I feel like vulnerability culture, especially in corporate spaces, maybe I'm just too cynical, but I feel like that's more of like a data collection that benefits the corporation rather than, and I mean that in a serious way, right? Because again, like all these things about vulnerability culture, if you're in upper management, if that's one of the things about like the workplace, right? Because you hear about like abusive bosses that raise their voice and don't have good emotional regulation, and they can get away with it, right? Bosses can get away with behaviors that subordinates would get immediately terminated for. In general, that's just a general workplace hierarchy. Owners can be, extremely unpleasant and rude, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And workers just have to put up with it. Remember,
well, not only just put up with it, but that element of enforced corporate vulnerability. There's a danger also that it actually just opens you up for more abuse from your boss, because now they know the trigger points.
Exactly. That's the whole point of what I mean by like data collection that is useful to management. Because a lot of times in terms of vulnerability, again, most people, they don't need to be confessing at work. Like they need money to have more time off, have more vacation hours, have more time to spend with friends and family and people that you care and love. Again, like none of these things are considered what creates vulnerability. It's not like this lack of like our ability to live a life outside of work.
Totally. And I feel as if I like the concept of performative vulnerability, and it really resonates. Everything that you've both been saying completely resonates with our argument. And there seems something just so pernicious, even more pernicious than, say, the mobilization of confidence or resilience, that vulnerability can be mobilized in such a cynical way.
Another thing that sort of fits into this confidence culture stuff is this, you had this term hollow defiance in regards to lots of popular anti-self-help books. I had read that The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck book, and then I did see the documentary. And the way I'd framed it is maybe this advice works for a certain class of person with a certain amount of resources. And I'm not sure I agreed with his point about you're not so special. I think that was him just trauma dumping on the world. But yeah, you nailed something in that. Like these self-help books, these anti-self-help books are somehow, just like the vulnerability thing, it appears to wear the clothes of, hey, I'm one of you. But it actually just sort of doubles down in this sort of smoke and mirrors confusing emotional landscape. It actually just plays the same tricks, right?
Yeah. But even worse, maybe because it's pretending to be subversive and pretending to be this kind of rebellious anti-self-help thing. Yeah. And just really struck by the language, the sort of language of rebellion and the way that gets used. And yet actually the sort of exhortations and suggestions, injunctions of this kind of stuff are just so similar to what went before. They're just pretty much identical, but in a new bottle kind of thing with a new anti-self-help brand. And we see it a lot in advertising as well. We talk in the book, we talk a lot about love your body advertising, and kind of from Doves and L'Oreal onwards and through the sort of total mainstreaming of this sort of independent, empowered, usually female subject. And the way that that's now morphing into a sort of breaking the rules advertising, as we call it. where, yeah, again, it's that hollow defiance. It's this idea that people are being told that they can break the rules, they can be defiant, they can be whoever they want to be. And it's actually just not offering anything new at all. It's not genuinely a real critique.
Yeah, I remember having my mind blown. Maybe it's a bit naive, but I remember discovering that Unilever owned both Dove and Lynx, or Axe, I think it's called in America. And if you look at how they advertise to people, like Dove, it's like, hey, just love your body, man. And then Lynx is, women need to be in bikinis running after men on beaches and stuff. It's okay, sure. These brands really care about the thing that they say that they care about.
I remember this is a while back when like the whole influencer culture and using normal people as models kind of thing was trending. One of his major comments was, oh, what we see as progress and innovation at the corporate side is almost always a cost cutting. Because if you look at things like OceanGate or Uber, or what they frame as innovation is ultimately just another way of saying a way to cut labor, a way to cut corporate responsibility towards their employees or people that work under them, et cetera, et cetera. And same thing with a lot of times with, granted, I don't know how the model works anymore. Back in the day when some of the brands were like, no, not using models and just using regular people, he was just going, oh yeah, like these people aren't getting paid like models would get paid.
I was going to ask basically how you push back, like how you fight, how you cut through the noise of the sort of just love yourself and everything's going to be all right narrative stuff. Are there particular things you found in the culture or just stuff in your sort of investigations that is, for want of a better word, authentic or useful?
It goes back to what Shani was saying at the start in a way about just like happy we've been that this has resonated with people, because as she said, confidence, it has become this kind of article of faith, obviously in the corporate world, but more generally as well. And it's one of those things that nobody would want to do a takedown of because it's so universally regarded as a good thing. But I feel that the step that we've taken in a way is actually just naming it, naming what this is and what this does. And the reactions have been it's resonated so much for people, and it's given them a language. Maybe this is just the kind of typical social science cop-out that all you can actually offer is a naming, and then other people have to take it further. But it really has resonated, and we've had, in the course of presenting the work and speaking to different organizations, a whole variety of different organizations, people have given us more and more examples of this in action. And I think in just being able to articulate it and speak about it, that is a first step.
Actually, what it reminded me of was the Adam Curtis, the latest thing, the Trauma Zone documentary. There's a bit in that where a group of Russian women are being taught how to smile or how to use their body in a particular way. And I was like, it resonates here because that's like the sort of technology of the self stuff, right? This is how you have to be in order to navigate this world. And to some degree, they're not wrong, but it's just like calling it out is definitely the first step. I agree. And then you find all these other examples of it. But yeah, sorry, I interrupted. Any responses there?
Not at all. Shani, I was just thinking about some of the workplace, the sort of workplace initiatives and the kind of pushback against those confidence training programs that I wondered if you wanted to say something about those.
Yeah, and I think I'd like also to say that in the book, in the conclusion, we conceptually think about and propose the notion of confidence climate instead of the confidence cult, because we want to also emphasize that we want to retain the focus on female confidence and particularly the kind of significance of supporting and empowering and women and all people, particularly marginalized and this kind of underserved backgrounds. But we want to shift the emphasis from the individualized and psychologist imperative. And that's why we bring the climate of confidence And it's particularly actually inspired by the kind of foundational 1970 feminist text, Our Bodies, Ourselves, which was written by the Boston Women's Health Book Collective, because there they distinguish between what they call the climate of doubt that surrounds particularly women's pregnancy and birth, and they talk about climate of confidence. And we borrow this to think about really climate, and the workplace is a really good example. How can we think about the ways in which collective and structural factors can really provide safe work and home environments where women and really all people will thrive and be supported? And so in the context of really work culture, it often, and we heard over when we did all these talks, meetings and workshops in different workplaces about ways that, again, workplace can push back against this individualization of confidence, even by pushing back very much the narrow common definition of what confidence is. So in one of our conversations, I remember in one of the organizations, people reflected on how confidence is often used when assessing someone, either in promotions or kind of milestone throughout the career, or even when recruiting, when job interviews and so on. The panel then sits and say, she lacks confidence, yeah? And so rethinking actually what do we mean by confidence and the ways in which we might measure and evaluate it differently, expand what it means, but also think about other qualities and things that workplaces should value. And fundamentally, very much just pushing against this idea that it's women and employees more generally as individuals that should be responsible for somehow overcoming their confidence issues or deficit. The amount of people we met who told us that they were sent on to these trainings and workshops where they teach them how to be confident, and then coming back to toxic work cultures where they're being bullied or unsupported or belittled, which in many ways just underscores the kind of discrepancy between those trainings and those quite superficial confidence boosting, training. So it's really, I think, to us, that the notion of climate, how do you think about building and then sustaining a climate that is aimed at nurturing confidence rather than thinking about confidence in something that is an individual project?
And it's also kind of pernicious in the sense that I feel like a lot of these corporations offer these workshops, not because they want people to be confident, but because they can say that they care about their employees' well-being. Because it's ultimately like some of the things that corporations say that they like out of their employees are the exact things that get seen as like not being confident, right? For example, employers are like, we want our employees to take our feedback seriously. But a lot of times, if you push back against like your performance review or whatever, they don't take to that kindly. They don't see that as confidence. They see that as arrogance. They see that as overconfidence. They see that as difficult to manage.
The idea of a de-confidence course, money. Yeah.
And, so much about a lot of these work and social spaces is ultimately like these double speaks, right? Where they say they want one thing, but the reality is that like they often want the exact opposite.
Yeah. My take on a lot of the corporate world stuff is a lot of positive words, but with ruthless intention.
Right.
And it's navigating that is a real, you need time to recharge to figure out like what word salad you just had to unpick and figure your way through. And again, it's all about power, isn't it? It's who has power. Like you said, the boss is allowed a certain range of emotions that people under them.
Yeah. I think it struck us that it seems to be far beyond the corporate world and public sector, in the charity sector. And Ros, you correct me, but my sense is that sometimes some employers at least seem to use these tools and appropriate these discourses, perhaps with good intentions, but it's just partly because, again, it's become this unquestioned mantras and apparatuses that it's not so much that they're necessarily cynical, but that has become framed as the magic bullet or the solution. And they're not necessarily questioning and thinking outside of this. And also there's a whole industry that feeds into this. So there's whole coaching and training programs and retreats. So there's a whole kind of industry that is being feeding these type of solutions to workplaces that seem in many ways very seductive. And I think we want both to say that we don't want to dismiss completely their value. At least they might work. For some people might feel that these techniques might be empowering or useful in some ways, but they ultimately, again, just add up to or reinforce a sense that it's individual solutions that work for some people, but they let the hook off organizations and institutions and from tackling it systemically and structurally.
Right, yeah, but I think in terms of these kinds of things infecting outside the corporate sector, if you're in a caretaking field, whether that's like therapy, treatment, teaching, nursing, etc., it's especially pernicious in kind of a cynical way in these spaces, right? Because ultimately, what is one of the biggest, if you are working, right, what is one of the biggest confidence erosion factors, right, is that if you are constantly given work that you can't finish under deadline, doesn't matter how efficient you are, doesn't matter how talented you are, if that is the environment, that is going to erode your confidence, right? It's going to erode your confidence in the workplace. It's going to make you feel burned out, all these things. So ultimately, like whenever you talk to people in caretaking fields, they always bring up like understaffing is a serious issue that is pervasive in, I know the NHS the nurses have talked about understaffing and underpaid. And again, these quote unquote self-care, these confidence courses, this vulnerability courses, right? All these things are a workplace Band-Aid that is just like, we just really don't want to hire more people and pay you more money.
Yeah. Yeah.
And because this is all like a part of that self-care umbrella. And self-care is ultimately about, we don't have the obligation to care for you. This is your responsibility.
Right now, our doctors run strike. Their banners are exactly overwhelmed, underpaid. They're not about, please let us be more vulnerable at work or have more confidence.
Those are the things, those are the climate things that is implied by when you say like a confidence climate, right? You can't have a confidence climate in a system with no redundancies.
And it goes back really to the paradox, which really underpins our book, because it's precisely when there is such profound inequality at work, when societal policies following the recession and following COVID hit the most vulnerable hard, precisely also the time that women and girls are subjected to intense pressures and unrealistic body ideals. So precisely when the climate is structurally really against the most vulnerable in society is when we see those kind of confidence imperatives rising. And that's the paradox. And it's, the shifting from all these kind of deepening inequalities and pressures, specifically and particularly upon women, and moving, kind of shifting attention from them and calling women more and more to believe in themselves and to feel comfortable in their own skin when everything else is stuck against them.
One of the, in therapy speak, if you are in therapy, if you are in mental health treatment of any kind, like talk of self-esteem is always a huge aspect of the conversation. And it's just, how do we expect people to have self-esteem when we have a society that regards the self as the enemy?
Yeah.
Because ultimately, like, what is a lack of self-esteem? It's when you view yourself as the enemy. And that's that whole entire marketing scheme of these unattainable beauty standards. Because it's also the unattainable appearance standards are definitely geared towards women, but how we present male bodies have changed drastically the last 30, 40 years. I remember action heroes back in Bruce Willis in the 80s was like an average looking guy, like physically speaking too. Like he was in good shape, but he wasn't like the level of shape that you would see in like fitness competitions. Like he looks like a guy that could be like, oh yeah, he could probably be if he showed up as a fireman, I wouldn't be afraid for my life. And that kind of like presentations of the male physique was relatively the norm until with Arnold and those guys being the exception. And now everyone has to have this extreme physical fitness competition level body. A lot of the confidence thing in terms of how it's gendered is that with men, it's a lot more specific. And with women, it tends to be a lot more amorphous.
And with men, it's not just more specific, but it's more kind of targeted, it's more behavioral, whereas with women it's much deeper. It involves a complete self-transformation, lots and lots of endless labor on the self, as well as those physical changes or those linguistic changes, or change the way you stand, change the way you write emails, or any of those things. But ultimately it's a psychological project.
Absolutely.
Is there anything that obviously it's a huge topic, but was there anything maybe that you feel like we've missed out or you wanted to close out with?
I guess our slogan, if you could call it that, is it. Firstly, the point about ambivalence, which Shani made earlier about how I think it really resonates with the podcast and the theme of we're in this, we can't escape it right now. We're living in this, but we also want to critique it and take it down. And we've put that into a sort of sentence of change the world, not the women.
Massive thank you as always to our VIP patrons, Rebecca Johns, Bruce Rogers Vaughan, Alexander Lashley, Sheena Belmas, Seamus O'Connell, Alex Placito, Alexandra McCormick, Wig Shaker, Elizabeth McKechnie, Fontaine, Hartley Wilmoth, Red Yen Cola, and Sean Venardo.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
And if you want to hear even more from Harriet, check out her radio show, Interpersonal Update, on WBAI and in the WBAI archives.